Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. Isn't that a beautiful nigun? That was Eitan Katz doing his Elul nigun, a nigun for the month of Elul, which we are now in, counting down the days toward Rosh Hashanah. We've got a beautiful teaching tonight from tractate Eruvin. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this lovely Sunday evening? Let us see. James Roth with us from Indianapolis. Yehudat Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. John Shore from Smoky, Sedona, Arizona. You ain't kidding. When we were driving home just at the end of last week from Yosemite, it was more than a 4-hour drive, over 200 miles through the middle of California, and it was just a smoky haze the entire trip. Please join me in praying that these wildfires, which are quickly becoming the largest in California history, and that's saying a lot, that they should go out soon, that no firefighters or first responders or homeowners or anybody should be hurt, that the homes should be saved. It's a calamity. And we pray together that we should only hear good news and these fires should end soon. And let's say amen. Also with us tonight, Ed Berg from Galloway, New Jersey. Gwen Strong says shalom on this fine evening. Joy Lynn from New Jersey. Nancy Brundemel Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Vaughn Billow from Fremont, Ohio. Melissa Iteljurin from Great Neck, New York. Brian Goff from Flagstaff, Arizona. John Fine from Longmeadow, Massachusetts. John is praying for the firefighters and people affected by the wildfires. Irving Gordon says shalom from West Warwick, Rhode Island. Andy Hamowitz, shalom from Taos, New Mexico. Sigrid White from Ukiah, California. Susan March from Kansas City, Missouri. Ed Berg says, I used to live in Holyoke, just near the Holyoke Mall. Lucy says shalom from Minneapolis. Who else is with us? Stephen Giguere from Dover, New Hampshire. Bernard Rich from Houston, Texas. We should only hear news. Everyone agrees we should get an amen. Tom Beck is shalom from Philadelphia. And John Fine says he's a retired firefighter. Thank you so much for your service, John. Okay. So let's get into it. We are holding on page 14, Daf Yud Dalet, of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're still in chapter 1. Yesterday we finished our discussion of Mishnah number 2, and today we'll be starting and beginning with God's help, our discussion of Mishnahs 3 and 4 here in chapter 1 of Masechet Eruvin. Okay, let's see. So we're still talking about taking a private lane, a mavoi, also called an alleyway, which joins several courtyards. In each courtyard, there's a couple of townhouses or more. And so it's a neighborhood, and this whole neighborhood empties out into this private lane, and then the private lane leads out into the public thoroughfare. So we've been talking all along about how we adjust this private lane, this alleyway, so that the people who live in this neighborhood, in these courtyards that empty into the private lane, can carry there on Shabbos. That's the general topic. Here in this Mishnah number 3, we're talking about, as we've seen, there's several ways to correct that alleyway. We can put a crossbeam over the entrance. We can put side posts beside the entrance. As we saw that Beis Hillel says, a post or a crossbeam. Beis Shammai said a post and a crossbeam. In both these cases, we're talking about openings that are 10 cubits wide or less. The alley is 10 cubits wide or less. If it's wider than that, there's other corrective measures that are necessary. All right, so now we're talking about just the crossbeam itself, and we're going to talk about what are the minimum requirements for that crossbeam. Now, what's interesting in our discussion today, if we remember the overall picture here, is that we're looking at this space. We're thinking about, okay, people are going to carry there on Shabbos. We want to make sure that they don't come to transgress. They don't come to commit the sin of carrying on Shabbos. So this is a protective measure imposed by the rabbis to protect people from coming to transgress. In other words, we are transforming a space for the purpose of holiness. It's no other purpose. This crossbeam, this side post, it's not decorative. It's not a street marker. It's not to tell us, what is the name of this lane. This is a specific correction so that people don't come to make a transgression there. So it's a holy enterprise that we are getting into. That's what we're doing. What makes today's discussion interesting is how we get there. Let's look at how the rabbis interact with each other as they're trying to come to what is the correct measurement. What's at stake here is not the specific numbers or the comparisons or how we're going to understand if the beam is wide enough, strong enough, etc. It's how the rabbis interact with each other in their process as they get to the final ruling. All right, the Mishnah says a crossbeam to permit carrying in this mavoi, so a crossbeam over the entrance of the alleyway, that crossbeam itself has to be wide enough to receive a small brick. So as we've seen with the rabbis, they didn't have measurements like cubic centimeters or cubic inches or liters or quarts or gallons. They had their own system of measurements, and they sound quaint to us, but they were standardized enough that everyone knew what they were talking about. So now they're saying that this crossbeam has to be wide enough to receive a small brick. What's a small brick? Well, a small brick is half the width of a large brick. What's a large brick? So a large brick, it's actually not like when we have an image in our minds of a brick, it's the kind of bricks that we make a wall out of, right? And they're kind of a rectangle like this, and they're maybe this thick, right? And maybe this thick, this wide, and about this long. These are more like pavers, okay? So the bricks that they're talking about, the rabbis in the Talmud are talking about, are a little bit more like pavers. They're square, they're thin in terms of depth. A large brick is 3 handbreadths wide. A small brick, so these are like small pavers that you would pave your path from your door out to the road. A small brick is about a handbreadth and a half, a tefach and a half, right? So a handbreadth and a half, right? So that's about the width. This is about the width of the brick, and maybe it's a square that's going to be about that size. That's what a small brick is. And we're saying that the crossbeam over the entrance of the alley has to be wide enough, the beam itself wide enough to receive the small brick. The small brick has a width of about a handbreadth and a half, a tefach and a half. So presumably the crossbeam the width of it needs to be at least a handbreadth and a half, a tefach and a half, right? Wrong. It only needs to be a handbreadth wide because the small brick, which is a handbreadth and a half, it could hang over the edge a little bit. You could use a little bit plaster to hold it in place. So a handbreadth is enough to hold up a handbreadth and a half over that crossbeam. So the Mishnah tells us that the crossbeam basically needs to be a handbreadth wide. That's how wide it has to be. Now that we're talking about bricks, and the question should immediately come to our minds, why, if at the end of the day, the crossbeam needs to be about a handbreadth wide, why are we bringing bricks into this discussion? We could just say it needs to be a handbreadth wide. Answer, because the question is, does it need to be sturdy enough that if you put a brick on top of it, that it would hold up that brick and not collapse? A piece of wood, a beam, a board, excuse me, could obviously hold up that brick. Something made out of straw, rope, or reed, that is not going to be able to hold up the brick. Rabbi Yehuda says it doesn't need to hold up the brick. But the sages disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. It does need to be. It needs to be wide enough to hold the brick, and it needs to be sturdy enough to hold the brick. That is the ruling that we get in the Mishnah. The Mishnah also is going to ask, what about the shape of this beam? We're just imagining a flat board across the opening of the alley. What if this beam is curved, right? So that the beam itself maybe goes out in a big curve, or it's straight, and then in the middle it has a curve. It says if it's curved, we treat it as if it's straight. It has to do the job as if it was straight. What if it's round? And now I want to thank Neil Green, who sent to me. You may remember that while Rabbi Abish Rand sat in for me while I was away, he had lovely illustrations in a particular volume of the Talmud that he was using. I'm going to butcher the name of it. It's sort of like Hamaor, Hamaerev, but that's not quite right. Anyway, the illustrations are great. Neil Green from Virginia sent me a PDF of those illustrations. Thank you, Neil. So now I can hold these up, and it's going to help us understand, right? So here is that you can see what we're looking at is the cross section of the beam over the entrance of the alley. In this case, it's round rather than square in its cross section. So now the question is, okay, well, how wide does it need to be? What does its circumference need to be? And now we get into just a little tiny bit of math, but very little. No problem if math was not your subject. All you have to know is that the diameter of this round beam needs to be at least a handbreadth, just as if it was square. What does that mean about the circumference? You might remember from high school math that the relationship between the circumference, right, of a circle and the diameter of the circle, the width of the circle, is that the circumference is pi times, right, what is it, pi, 2 pi r, right? In other words, pi d. That the circumference is equal to 3.14159, etc. It's an irrational number that goes on forever. But basically, what the sages are going to say, that the circumference is basically 3 times the diameter. And they know that the circumference of a circle is not 3 times the diameter. It's a little bit more. It's just a little bit more, right? 3.141. So they're saying it's just a little bit more than 3, but it's close enough if we understand that it needs to be 3. So if you're going to measure the circumference, it needs to be 3 handbreadths. If you're going to measure the diameter of this beam that goes across the opening of the alley, it needs to be 1 handbreadth wide, just as if it was a regular square board of lumber. That's the key that we are learning there. Okay, now let's get into the Gemara, the discussion of this Mishnah. Rav Chisda says that both the beam and its supports must be able to hold up the brick. In other words, the question was asked, okay, the beam needs to be strong enough to hold up the brick. Not only wide enough, but sturdy enough to hold up the brick. The question was asked, what about the supports that hold up the beam? What if they will hold up a board, but they won't hold up a board with a brick on it? is it good enough? Right? The brick is hypothetical. It needs to be strong enough to hold up the brick, but we're not actually going to put a brick on it. So do the supports that hold up the beam, do they need to be strong enough to hold up a beam that could hold up a brick? Answer, yes. The supports also need to be strong enough to hold up a beam with a brick on top of it. And this all makes sense, right? What are we trying to accomplish here? We're trying to set up this alley with some kind of a permanent enough, right? It doesn't have to be like etched in stone, but it has to last so that people, when they forget about it, they're going to be covered for the fact that they're going to carry there on Shabbos. This has to be a visible, conspicuous marker, and it has to have a certain amount of strength. Rabbi Yehuda said it doesn't have to have that much strength. It doesn't need to hold up the brick. It just needs to be visible and conspicuous. But the rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda, said, no, it has to be sturdy. And so they're saying it's got to last, right? It's got to be a real thing. It's got to have some construction value there that's going to make it last, and people are going to be more aware of it because of this. Rav Sheshet says, if a person draped a mat over that crossbeam, and the mat hung down to exactly 3 handbreadths above the ground, has he created an alley? Has he adjusted the alley so that people can carry there? No, he has accomplished nothing. In fact, he took away a crossbeam that might have allowed people to carry. What is the problem with this mat that is draped over the crossbeam and hangs to within 3 handbreadths of the ground, or exactly 3 handbreadths from the ground? At the top, the problem is that this mat that he draped over the crossbeam obscures the crossbeam. The whole idea is that crossbeam is a visible, conspicuous marker. Now that something is draped over it, we don't see it, we're not aware of it. He's taken away its usability for Shabbos. This will teach us also that we don't use the crossbeam that's used to define an area where people can carry on Shabbos as a clothesline, right? We're not going to dry our clothes on it. Now, this mat hangs down. Now, if it just hung over the top, maybe it would be okay. It might even make it more conspicuous. He's saying it really doesn't work. You've made the whole thing obscured, so don't hang anything over it. But maybe it might work, except that this mat hangs all the way down to 3 handbreadths above the ground. What's the problem with 3 handbreadths above the ground? Well, it doesn't come to the ground, right? If it was just a little bit more, in other words, if it hung a little lower so that it was within 3 handbreadths of the ground, then it would be like it was a partition that goes all the way down to the ground. Now it would work not as a marker, but rather as a mechitza, as a partition. It's like he created an actual 4th wall for the alley, and we can carry in there as if it was a courtyard rather than a corrected alleyway. But he didn't get close enough to the ground. We've learned that the concept of extending a wall down, it has to be within 3 handbreadths of the ground. Why 3 handbreadths? I love this. Why 3 handbreadths? Because if it's less than 3 handbreadths, a goat can't get under it. The rabbis define 3 handbreadths as the amount of space it takes a goat to get under a fence. Anything less than 3 handbreadths, the goat can't get under it. It's as if that partition went all the way down to the ground, and we have a valid partition. But if it's exactly 3 handbreadths above the ground, the goat can get under it. It doesn't work as a partition. It doesn't work as a conspicuous marker above, and now we can't carry there on Shabbos. The sages say, if we have a beam within 3 tefachim, within 3 handbreadths of another beam, I think we have an illustration of that. Oh, yes. So here we have, we're getting to this one. So sorry, we're not up to that one yet. Okay. So the sages say that, just so we understand, in terms of, so we just said that we have to come within 3 handbreadths of the ground, a little bit closer than 3 handbreadths to the ground. It would act as a partition. That's extension down. Extension to the sides, that's the concept of lavud. So if the beam comes within 3 handbreadths of the other side of the alley, it's good. It's a good beam. We can carry there. If there are two beams that extend from either side of the alley, as long as they come within 3 handbreadths of each other, it's as if they actually meet. It's like one beam across. The gap doesn't count as long as that gap in the beam, it's like 2 beams that form one beam. The gap doesn't matter as long as that gap is less than 3 handbreadths wide. Okay. Now we have the example of 2 cross beams that each one alone will not hold up the small brick, right? So we have it like that, but the 2 of them together, spaced a little bit apart, are going to be wide enough and sturdy enough to hold up the brick. So does this count as a kosher beam, cross beam, that's going to allow us to carry in that alley? Yes, that works. And Rabbi Yosei adds that this will work even if those 2 beams are not, right, like just tilting it a little bit so you can see, they're running parallel with each other so the brick can rest on top of them. It'll also work if they're on top of each other. This is odd, right? Because you cannot put, if the 2 beams, these 2 thin beams that would work together if they were parallel because they could hold up the brick, together they would be wide enough and sturdy enough to hold up the brick. Now we're taking them from being next to each other, running parallel, and putting one over the other. So we know that if we put this brick on top of the upper beam, it's too thin. It won't hold it up. You can't balance the brick there, and it's not sturdy enough to hold the brick there. Yet, since we have 2 beams, and they would work if they were parallel, if they were placed one over the other, it will still work. And we learned that from Rabbi Yosei. Who is Rabbi Yosei? He's the son of Rabbi Yehuda. And so the Gemara comments that Rabbi Yosei agrees with his father in Rabbi Yehuda in some things and disagrees with his father in others. He agrees with his father, who Rabbi Yehuda said that the beam does not have to be sturdy enough to hold up the brick. And in this case, Rabbi Yosei is saying, well, you need 2 beams, but if they're even one above and one below, this one above, it can't hold up the brick. And yet, it's going to count as long as it has the one below. So he seems to agree with his father on that. But we learned way back at the first mission, at the beginning of Tractate Eruvin, that if that crossbeam is more than 20 cubits above the ground, the sages say it's no good, it needs to be lowered. Rabbi Yehuda said it would be good, and he took that from the example of a king's palace, where often the entrances were very grand and very tall, and so it shouldn't matter if that crossbeam is more than 20 cubits above the ground. But the sages said no to Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because people don't look up. If it's more than 20 cubits high, people aren't going to notice it's there. They'll forget that it's there. It is no longer conspicuous to them, and they'll come to carry not knowing why they're carrying. This is all an educational, policy-minded program about helping people carry where it's okay to carry and not carry where it's not okay to carry on Shabbos. We covered that. Okay, now there's the example of the curve. So we have an illustration for that. Okay, so here is a beam that has a curve in it. As you can see, it's a beam that goes all the way across the alley, but in the middle of it, it has this curved portion that juts out outside the alley into the public thoroughfare. The Mishnas said, we look at this beam as if it was straight, right? If we took out that curved part and it was just a straight beam without that curved part, is it a kosher beam then? Yes. So then this is going to work as a kosher beam. So what are we learning? This would seem obvious. Rabbi Zeir says, no, you got to understand how this works. This beam is going to work as a kosher beam if you could take away that curved piece and what would be left would still work, right? So that curved piece, imagine that you take it away. So what's left is 2 beams that come close to each other in the middle, but don't meet. So what did we just learn about that situation? 2 beams that come close to each other. They need to come within 3 handbreadths of each other. Then it's kosher and we can carry in the alley. But if you take away that curved portion of this beam and what's left is a gap of more than the 3 handbreadths, then it doesn't work. It's not one beam. It needs to be adjusted. We need to bring another beam or extend these beams, somehow get that gap to be less than 3 handbreadths. We also have a question. Are we concerned when this beam has this curved portion in the middle that extends out into the public thoroughfare that people will think, oh, well, this is the definition of where I can carry. Since there's this curved part that juts out into the public thoroughfare, maybe they're going to think that they can carry in that curved part too. In other words, they can take a step out into the public domain carrying this thing on Shabbos, and they cannot do that. They would violate Shabbos. In fact, they would carry from the private domain, which is this adjusted alley, out into the public thoroughfare. That curved part, it's as if it wasn't there. But people might think, oh, but it does permit me to carry as long as I'm under the beam. Aren't we concerned about that? And the answer is, according to Rabbi Zera, no, we're not concerned about that. So this is nice because what you're getting here is that the rabbis are saying, look, we're going to help people not come to accidentally violate Shabbos, but the people, I mean, they have to be left a little bit to their own devices. We can't legislate everything for them. I actually thought about this when we were up at Yosemite last week. There's these incredible scenic curvy roads within the park, sometimes like right along a cliff with a hairpin turn. And you're just accustomed, if that's a public road in California, like a state road, I mean, there's going to be a guardrail along that curve when it's a hairpin turn over a cliff. And yet in Yosemite Park, there's no guardrail there. Why? Probably the reason is that, it's a different law and you can't sue the national park system if you drive over that cliff, whereas you can sue the state of California. I'm just guessing here. But the difference is, right, they're saying, okay, look, a lot of people are going to come through here, but we're just going to, leave it to you to be responsible for your own safety. We're not going to legislate everything, right? And this is what's always happening when lawmakers, figures of authority, in our case, the sages, in the case of a road, whoever's in charge of that in the state of California or in a federal national park, someone has to make a decision. On the one hand, we want to protect people from coming to do a transgression or even to harm themselves. On the other hand, we don't want to overburden people with too many safety measures, too much legislation, too high of cost to the taxpayer, etc. And if you go to other countries that have less litigious societies in other countries, like you don't find so many safety mechanisms outside of America as you do here. And it's that balancing act. How much are we going to impose on people to, create safety for them, and how much are we going to leave it to them to make themselves safe? It's a balancing act. So in this case, where people might come to think that you can step out in the public domain because of that curved portion of the crossbeam, well, we're just not going to worry about that. The curved part, people should know better. They should learn. How often is it going to happen that they step out just because they see this curved part? It's not something that we worry about, says Rabbi Zera. Okay. Let's continue. That's the curved portion. We're not concerned. And now that we've brought up the relationship between the circumference of a circle and the width, the diameter of that circle, the Gemara just introduces, really only apropos of that, not fixing an alleyway by putting a beam over it, that the Sea of Solomon had this same relationship. In fact, that's where the rabbis look into scripture and see that the circumference of a circle has a 3-to-1 relationship with its diameter. They get that. Where is it actually in scripture? It's a description of the Holy Temple, of the Sea of Solomon. And it's a verse in the first book of Kings, chapter 7, 26. And so it says there that the circumference was about 3-to-1. And while we're at it, so we just get a couple of images. They don't really have it in the digital one, but there is a nice one here in the Koreh Talmud Bavli. And see, that's the Sea of Solomon. And it was a large, very large vessel that would be used for certain things in the temple. I'm not sure if the priests would immerse in it or if they would immerse objects in it, if it was used for purification. I'm not sure what they used it for right now. I just didn't research it. But it was an important vessel in the Holy Temple. And the importance here is how big it was, right? So a mikvah that you can immerse yourself in when you're impure and you need to become pure has to be at least 40 sa. Sa, it's a measure, 40 sa. What is 40 sa? It's something that is 1 cubit by 1 cubit by 3 cubits. Basically a bathtub, right? It's like the minimum volume where a human could immerse his whole body into it. How big was the Sea of Solomon, which was used for immersions? It was as big as 150 mikvahs, minimum mikvah sizes. So instead of having 40 sa, its volume measured 6,000 sa. This was a huge vessel to hold that much water. It's something that had been constructed for that purpose. It really brings, gives a little bit of a feeling of the grandeur and scale of Solomon's temple. All right, we continue. The fourth Mishnah. Now we've talked about what are the necessary dimensions of the crossbeam above the alley. Now we look at the necessary dimensions for a side post that's going to be used for the same purpose, to permit carrying there. Recall, Beis Hillel, and the law follows Beis Hillel, said that in order to adjust an alley so we can carry there on Shabbos, you need either the crossbeam above or the side post on the side of that opening. What is the minimum dimensions of that side post? It needs to be at least 10 tefachim high, 10 hand breadths high, so about 40 inches high, let's say. How thick does it need to be? The crossbeam needed to be a handbreadth thick, right, so that it was sturdy enough and wide enough to hold up a brick. But a side post, any dimension will do. It can be very thin indeed. It just needs to be 10 handbreadths high, but it's very obvious as you enter. It's right there next to you, so it doesn't, and it's not going to hold anything up. It's just a side post, so really any width will do. Says the Mishnah. And who is it that's going to object? Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei says, no. I disagreed with my dad, he generally disagreed with his father, just in the case of the one above and below. But generally speaking, he held with the other rabbis that it needed to be strong enough to hold up a brick. But here with the side post, the rabbis say any dimension will do. Rabbi Yosei says, come on, it needs to have some heft, something visible, something noticeable. So according to Rabbi Yosei, that side post needs to be quite a serious side post. It needs to be 3 tefachim thick. So that's quite a difference, right? Any width will do. So you can imagine like a rod that's 1 inch across. It could stand on the side and be the side post. Rabbi Yosei says it needs to be 3 hand breadths wide, right? These two plus the one in between, right? So now we're talking about something that's about 1 foot wide, much more substantial, according to Rabbi Yosei. The Gemara gets into the discussion. Rabbi Chia says that the law is not like what Rabbi Yosei says. It's like the rabbis. In fact, this side post can be as thin as a string. As thin as a string. What if we have a situation, I think we have an illustration for this, do we not? Where the side post is placed not at the opening, but halfway down the alley. You see the side post, you see that yellow line deep in the alley. So they put the side post halfway down the alley rather than at the entrance. What have you accomplished with such a side post? You can carry in the back of the alley behind that post. You cannot carry in the front of the alley from the side post to the street. So the same question gets asked like we had about that curved crossbeam. If we allow people to carry in the back half of the alley behind that post, that side post that was placed halfway down the alley, aren't we concerned that they'll forget that they can't carry in the front of the alley, that they can only carry in that back of the alley behind the side post? Answer, No, we're not concerned. Now, why are we having, we're going to give people a little bit more leeway, a little bit more personal responsibility? I mean, the sages really went out of their way to make sure that people weren't going to transgress. But this whole idea of the rabbinic adjustment of a private lane is a rabbinic prohibition, that they can't carry in that private lane without this adjustment. Because it's a rabbinic prohibition rather than a Torah prohibition, we're going to be more lenient, more easygoing with how we set these things up. So we're not concerned that people will forget they can only carry in that back half when the side post is halfway down the alley. Rabbi Yosei says that that side post at the front of the alley needs to be at least 3 handbreadths wide. Now, this is definitely the minority opinion. The law is like, at least according to the Mishnah, the law is like the rabbis who say it can be any width. But even though Rabbi Yosei's opinion is the minority view, the great Rebbe who put together the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, as well as Rava, one of the great sages in Babylonia, both hold according to Rabbi Yosei. They hold according to that minority view. So what's going on here? Which is the law? Isn't the law according to the majority as it's stated in the Mishnah? Why is he going to hold like the minority view of Rabbi Yosei? And the reason is because Rabbi Yosei is always right. He's one of those rabbis that is absolutely trusted because he was just faithful to the tradition. He wasn't, he was never giving a ruling without extensive research, bringing down precedents. He's just one of those guys who's totally trusted, rarely on the minority side of anything. He ends up on the minority here, but even Rebbi and Rava will hold like Rabbi Yosei. So this causes confusion in later generations. What are we supposed to do? We always hold like Rabbi Yosei, but here Rabbi Yosei is in the minority. So do we need a 3 handbreadth wide side post? And this is going to be the end of our discussion. So if you've got questions, put them in the comments now. I'm coming to it. Does it need to be 3 handbreadths wide or not? So Rava bar Rav Chana brought this question to Abaye. Are we going to hold like Rabbi Yosei, the way that Rebbi and Rava do, or are we going to go with the anonymous majority in the Mishnah, which says that any thickness will do? So Abaye says to Rava bar Rav Chana, go out and see what the people are doing. In other words, what is the wisdom of the crowd? Now, in a set of books that I really, really love and recommend to everybody, has nothing to do with Judaism or religion at all, but the Patrick O'Brien is a great author who wrote the Aubrey Maturin novels. If you ever see the movie Master and Commander, based on these novels, and Stephen Maturin, the ship's doctor and a great naturalist and philosopher and intelligence agent, whose conversation is never less than fascinating, says this very often. You will rarely find that the wisdom of a crowd is wrong. You will rarely find that a reputation in a village of an individual is wrong. Right? Whatever the reputation is of any particular individual in the village, it's usually right, says Stephen Maturin. And here we have this same idea. Abaye says, go out and see what the people are doing. They're surely going to get it right. Now, sometimes the crowd gets it wrong. I mean, we know that a crowd can get it wrong for sure. But where the law was established, pretty clearly at one time and now has been in place for a few generations, go out and see what the people are doing. The people were in fact using side posts that were thinner than 3 handbreadths wide, and that is the law. The halacha is, according to the majority opinion in our Mishnah, a side post does not need to be 3 handbreadths wide, according to Rabbi Yosei. Some people are going to be more machmir, more stringent, just because they want to make sure that the side post is noticeable, but it is not necessary to do that, and you have fulfilled your obligation with a much thinner side post. A similar question came up on the bracha, the blessing we say before having a drink of water. Some people said, oh, well, the blessing that we should say is, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates so many different creatures and their needs, everything that they need to sustain themselves. And the other view was, the blessing for a glass of water is, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. There were valid precedents for using either of those brachas, either of those blessings before drinking a glass of water. The same question was brought to Abaye. He said, go out and see what the people are doing. Pok Chazai, Pok Chazai. Go and see what the people are doing. And his disciple went out and saw that the people were saying shehakol. Shehakol nihiyeh b'divaro, by whose word everything comes into being. And so whenever we have a drink of water, or we make a lechaim over some kind of booze, anything but wine, right? Any drink but wine, the blessing is going to be, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehakol nihiyeh b'divaro. Normally, I wouldn't say a blessing if I didn't go and drink water afterward, but I can do that with you because this is an educational format and I'm teaching the blessing. That's what I've got for us today. Let us look at some questions or comments. Looks like there's only one. Carolyn Dobson Chavez says, for the 365 prohibitions you mentioned yesterday, how many are per the Torah versus rabbinic? All of them. All of them are the Torah, right? So the 613 commandments, 365 negative prohibitions, 248 positive obligations. These are all considered to be doraisa, biblical. There are thousands of sort of rabbinic regulations to keep us on the straight and narrow so that we don't come to stray, to forget to do the positive obligation or neglect, and to somehow forget and transgress the negative prohibitions. But all 613 are considered to be biblical mitzvahs. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. It's great to be learning with you in the evening. Look forward, with God's help, to getting together again tomorrow, regular time, 6 p.m. Remember, we are in Elul, the Hebrew month of Elul, the last month of the year. We're headed toward Rosh Hashanah. This is a month where we examine our deeds, we increase our mitzvahs, we especially increase tzedakah. We especially increase giving to righteous causes, and in particular for Torah education. This is a very propitious time to give to organizations that teach Torah. Of course, Accidental Talmudist teaches a lot of Torah to a lot of people around the world. We are a nonprofit organization, so it would be wonderful if you donated to us. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. But I encourage you to give to whatever organization you want to support at this time. When we show compassion for our community, the Heavenly Court shows compassion for us when we all come before the Heavenly Court for judgment on Rosh Hashanah. That's